The truth of cinema has never lived in the scripts. The world was allowed to read. It has always existed in the frames that were trimmed, softened, or buried before anyone could notice. In the early 1990s, as the Cold War ended and Hollywood tried to reshape the image of power, a handful of action films emerged that carried something the studios didn't want: stories that felt too raw, too political, or too close to realities. They preferred to keep silent. They weren't the big-budget blockbusters that defined the decade. They were smaller, stranger, rougher creations, films born from the friction between truth and spectacle. Some were rewritten until their meaning dissolved. Some were released in forms that resembled ghosts of their original intent. Others were quietly pushed aside, deemed too dangerous for mainstream audiences. Yet in each of them, buried beneath the explosions and the smoke, is a fragment of the era's unfiltered anxieties. Governments in collapse, power shifting hands, unresolved wars echoing through fictional battlegrounds. These are the kinds of films that didn't just entertain, they revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1, McBain, 1991. It begins like a conventional rescue fantasy, but McBain carries the unmistakable pulse of a film wrestling with something heavier than its surface suggests. Released in 1991 and directed by James Glickenhaus, the movie pairs Christopher Walken with a narrative about American intervention in a foreign uprising. A premise that felt uncomfortably close to geopolitical tensions of the late 20th century. Walken's stoic performance adds a strange gravity, as if he understood that the story wasn't just gunfire and explosions. Beneath the theatrics, there was a commentary the studio seemed reluctant to acknowledge. On the surface, the film marketed itself as a straightforward mission piece. A group of former soldiers, a rebellion in Colombia, a hero stepping back into chaos to repay an old debt. Posters and trailers pushed adrenaline and spectacle, promising the kind of muscular action audiences expected in the early 90s. But the tone of the finished film feels oddly fractured, as if two different versions fought for control. One wanting to be an explosive adventure, the other hinting at the darker reality of foreign intervention. Behind the scenes, that conflict wasn't entirely fictional. Early cuts were said to contain longer scenes that explored the political motivations behind the rebellion and the consequences of American involvement. Reports circulated that the studio pushed for a simpler, more marketable narrative, removing dialogue they feared would polarize audiences. The result was a film that feels both ambitious and restrained, a story reaching for something larger while being pulled back into safer territory. Yet that tension is precisely what makes McBain linger. It stands as a reminder of a moment when Hollywood flirted with uncomfortable honesty, then stepped away before the implications became too sharp. In the gaps between what was shot and what was allowed to remain, the film reveals the truth of an era trying to rewrite its own reflection. Film 2, Deadly Outbreak, 1995. At first glance, Deadly Outbreak appears to be one of the countless mid-90s action vehicles built around a single charismatic fighter. Jeff Speakman, riding the momentum of his earlier success, steps into the role of a security specialist trapped inside a chemical weapons facility, overtaken by terrorists. The setup echoes the era's obsession with Die Hard scenarios. But the deeper story behind the film is far more chaotic than its taut premise suggests. The movie was promoted as a tight, kinetic thriller. Fast-paced combat, confined spaces, high stakes. Trailers showcased Speakman's martial arts precision and the film's glossy, high-risk laboratory setting. Yet the finished product carries an unmistakable sense of abruptness, as if it were carved down from a larger, more ambitious vision. Scenes cut sharply, transitions feel rushed, and entire character arcs appear hollowed out, signs that the film did not reach audiences in its intended form. Industry whispers later painted a clearer picture. Early versions allegedly explored the motivations of both the terrorists and the scientists inside the facility, giving the story a political and moral weight that contrasted with its action-first marketing. Some who worked on the production claimed that these sequences were trimmed or removed entirely after test screenings as distributors pushed for a more easily digestible martial arts-driven package. Speakman himself was reportedly frustrated that character depth and dramatic tension were overshadowed in the final edit. What remains is a film caught between identities. Part technical thriller, part martial arts, showcase part political cautionary tale. The seams show. But in those seams lies the real intrigue, the shadow of a version that tried to say more about the anxieties of bioweapons, security lapses, and the fragile systems meant to contain catastrophe. Deadly Outbreak may not reveal its buried truths outright, but the traces of what was removed are precisely what give it its strange, lingering energy. Film 3. Stone Cold, 1991. Some films look straightforward on the surface, loud, violent, built to shock. Yet behind their noise lies a story that was never allowed to be told in full. Stone Cold, released in 1991 and directed by Craig R. Baxley, is one of those films. Starring Brian Bosworth in his most memorable screen role, the movie presents itself as a biker gang infiltration thriller fueled by relentless stunts and a rebellious, lawless aesthetic. But what survives on screen is only part of what the filmmakers originally crafted. Promoted as a hard-edged, unapologetically wild action film, Stone Cold leaned into its attitude. Explosions erupting across highways, courtroom assaults, and Bosworth's ice-cold persona embedded inside a violent outlaw world. Audiences were sold spectacle, extremity, and swagger. Yet as the film unfolded, there was an unmistakable unevenness, tonal shifts, missing narrative beats, and abrupt transitions that felt like pieces had been lifted out of the story's spine. Those missing pieces were not imagined. Crew members later revealed that the film endured heavy trimming. Early cuts reportedly delved deeper into the cult-like psychology of the biker brotherhood, exploring themes of radicalization and authoritarian rebellion that paralleled real anxieties of the early 90s. Entire subplots involving Bosworth's undercover identity were said to have been removed, along with scenes that exposed the gang's internal fractures and the consequences of unchecked fanaticism. Some believe the studio feared the film's darker implications would provoke controversy or draw uncomfortable comparisons to real events, leading to a push for a cleaner, more commercially viable final version. What emerged was a film that still burns with intensity, but feels like a survivor of its own editing room war. The spectacle remained, but the commentary, the dangerous heart beating beneath the asphalt and leather, was muted. And in that silence, Stone Cold becomes something more intriguing than expected. A film defined not just by what it shows, but by what it was never permitted to reveal. Film 4. The Final Sanction, 1990. There are films that feel less like entertainment and more like dispatches from a world on the edge of collapse. The Final Sanction, released in 1990 and directed by David A. Pryor, sits precisely in that uneasy space. Made at the twilight of the Cold War, the film imagines a deadly contest between two soldiers, one American, one Soviet, staged as a last-ditch alternative to full-scale nuclear devastation. It is a premise drenched in political symbolism, yet what survived on screen is only a faint echo of the film that was originally conceived. Marketed as a low-budget action thriller, The movie promised hand-to-hand combat, military tension, and a symbolic confrontation between superpowers. But within moments of watching it, becomes clear that something is missing. Characters appear without context, motivations flicker in and out, and the emotional stakes feel strangely hollow, as if the story's core had been carved out long before audiences ever saw the final cut. Behind the scenes, the truth was more complicated. Early drafts reportedly explored the psychological toll of nationalism and the futility of proxy conflicts, presenting the duel not as spectacle, but as tragic theater orchestrated by governments desperate to save face. Some scenes, particularly those questioning the morality of the sanction itself, were rumored to have been trimmed or softened. There were tensions over how overtly the film should criticize both nations, especially at a moment when political alliances were shifting rapidly. Pryor, known for pushing boundaries even within tight constraints, was said to have delivered a version more reflective and disturbing than expected. What remains is a fragmented relic of a bigger, bolder idea. A film caught in the final breath of an era, defined by suspicion, fear, and competing narratives. In the gaps between its edited lines lies a portrait of two nations trying to avoid their own reflection, leaving the Final Sanction as a strangely haunting reminder of how quickly stories can be reshaped when the world changes around them. Film 5 Night Siege. Some films don't just fade from public memory. They fracture into versions, titles, and edits that seem to rewrite themselves with every reappearance. Night Siege, also known as Project Night Siege, is one of those cinematic phantoms. Little is widely known about its production, yet its tangled history speaks volumes. Multiple titles, conflicting synopses, shifting cuts, and inconsistent releases suggest a film that was never allowed to settle into a single identity. What remains feels like a puzzle whose missing pieces were quietly swept off the table. On the surface, the story resembled a tense military meets paranormal thriller, blending covert operations with unexplained phenomena. Marketing leaned heavily on the mysterious elements, promising audiences a collision between classified projects and forces beyond human control. But the final versions that circulated, sometimes abruptly edited, sometimes oddly rearranged, told a different tale. Scenes appear out of place, narrative threads vanish without conclusion, and the tone swings between grounded tactical realism and disorienting supernatural suggestion. Those erratic qualities didn't come from creative experimentation alone. Accounts from individuals connected to the film's early development hint at a more complicated truth. One draft allegedly presented a darker, more politically charged narrative involving unauthorized experiments and military cover-ups, a direction that distributors feared might provoke controversy. As the film changed hands between production companies, edits accumulated like scars, each new cut blunting themes that once aimed to question institutional secrecy. Even the title changes suggest hesitation, as if no one could decide how much of the original intention should be revealed. What survives today is less a finished film and more a fragmented artifact, a cinematic document that reflects the very subject it tried to explore: secrets layered beneath official narratives, glimpses of truth obscured by the need to control the message. In its fractured form, Night Siege becomes a mirror of the system that reshaped it, leaving behind the faint outline of a story that almost broke through the darkness. Bonus fact: The Lost Shadow of American Kickboxer 2, 1993. Every era leaves behind at least one film that feels less like a release and more like a rumor that escaped the editing room. In the early 1990s, that film was American Kickboxer 2, a sequel in name only stitched together from an entirely different story. While marketed as a straightforward martial arts thriller, the project's behind-the-scenes turmoil created a divide between what was filmed and what audiences ultimately received. And somewhere in the middle, a version of the movie quietly vanished. Production accounts describe a film that was originally structured as a darker custody battle drama, with action as emotional punctuation, not spectacle. Early scenes reportedly emphasized psychological strain, moral ambiguity, and a layered conflict between characters with painful histories. But as the studio grew concerned that such a narrative would alienate fans expecting pure fighting reshoots and re-edits accelerated. Entire character relationships were reshaped, new action scenes were inserted, and philosophical dialogue was stripped away. What remained was a hybrid, energetic, chaotic, and strangely hollow, as if its soul had been scooped out and replaced with something safer. The most intriguing part is the Phantom cut a longer version, whispered about by stunt performers and crew members. Some say it contained a completely different emotional trajectory. Others claim it revealed motivations erased from the final print. No confirmed copy has ever surfaced, and only fragments of production notes hint at what the film once aimed to be. It exists now as a cinematic shadow, a movie rewritten so aggressively that its original form may never be known. American Kickboxer 2 didn't just change during editing, it disappeared into it. And that disappearance is why it lingers. Some films fail on screen. Others were never even allowed to fail. Across these 5 films, a pattern emerges not in their plots, budgets, or reputations, but in the shadows that surround them. Each one represents a small rupture in the facade of Hollywood's carefully managed image. A moment when action cinema drifted too close to unfiltered truth. Whether it was political unrest, military secrecy, ideological tension, or the fear of drawing parallels to real events, something within these stories triggered a quiet recoil. The edits grew sharper, the narratives safer, and the versions that reached audiences became reflections rather than revelations. And yet what survives in these films, in their fractured cuts, strange tonal shifts and unfinished ideas, is a testament to an era wrestling with itself. The early 1990s were defined by endings the Cold War, dissolving global powers, rearranging, and Hollywood learning that spectacle could hide reality only for so long. These movies, buried beneath re-edits and misdirection, accidentally preserved the anxieties of that moment in history more honestly than the polished blockbusters ever could. In cinema, every reel hides a reality, and every cut hides a confession. These films remind us that truth often slips out from the seams, surviving in the fragments no one meant to leave behind. Which of these forgotten action films do you believe revealed too much, and which one deserved to be seen uncensored? If you want more stories like this, where the buried versions, the rewritten endings, and the lost cuts finally come to light, make sure to stay with us. Real Secrets, where the truth was always in the edit.